for those who know, is the sound that heralds the BBC's hit podcast, The Lazarus Heist. That podcast has now given birth to an audiobook. We speak to the presenter of the podcast and the author of the audiobook. His name is Geoff White, and he's just one person. Confused? You soon will be.
I am already, Steve, but that's nothing new. The first series of the BBC World Service's Lazarus Heist podcast came out, or dropped as the young people say, in 2021. It's a massive piece of work, with a sprawling global story and a cast of thousands. But ultimately, its purpose is to shine a light on North Korea's elite team of hackers who are known as the Lazarus Group, suspected of being behind a cyber robbery of a national bank that netted $1 billion. The podcast was presented by two people who are both undeniably experts in their chosen fields. Our guest, Geoff White, who's a technology and cybersecurity journalist who's spent a number of years working in the newsroom at Channel 4 in the UK and was the man behind Audible's podcast series The Dark Web, which I listen to and love. Jean Lee is, to put it mildly, a bit of a North Korea expert. She's an incredibly experienced journalist, and in 2009 she became the first foreign journalist to set up a press bureau in Pyongyang. Today, our focus is Geoff's audiobook, an audiobook that has sprung from the original podcast series. Here's a clip.
North Korea? Really? It's the response I often get when I tell people I'm researching North Korean computer hackers. Many people's image of this small Asian country, if they even have one, is of an idiosyncratic, isolated land whose limited technological skill is mainly spent on launching missiles and testing nukes. The idea that it has a force of computer hackers, let alone one of the world's most dangerous, seems outlandish. As an investigative journalist covering cybercrime, I have a very different perspective. Over the last decade or so, I've watched as the crimes being attributed to North Korea's cyber warriors, nicknamed the Lazarus Group by security researchers, have increased in scale, ferocity and ingenuity. Computer hacks have become a key weapon in North Korea's arsenal, and they now pose a significant threat to global security and stability.
Hello, I'm Steve Phillips and welcome to another episode of Audiobookclub, no longer the world's only interactive audiobook review and recommendation podcast. On this particular episode, we're reviewing The Lazarus Heist by Geoff White, an audiobook that's an extension of the BBC World Service's fantastic podcast series of the same name. Joining me down the line from Adelaide to help me in this endeavour in particular, and perhaps to discuss the difference between an audiobook and a podcast in general, is Matt Layton. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Steve.
So, what did you see about the difference between an audiobook and a podcast? This is where I really wanted to talk to Geoff. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to Geoff, anyway.
Well, look, let's start with this interview as a whole. Yes, it is confusing. Normally, you talk about the movie of the book, don't you? And it's like people who are smart Alex read the book first and didn't quite like the movie as much. In this case, we've got a podcast, a brilliant podcast series. The second podcast series I'd listened to from Geoff White, and it's a huge and sprawling and immense, brilliant story compacted into 10 episodes. Now, the thing is, do we need an audiobook of that podcast? Does that make sense? So it's given birth to a book, which, of course, in this day and age, and with Geoff White being a broadcaster, means he recorded the audiobook as well. And I think there's an interesting thing we can do here, which is define the definition of what's an audiobook, what's a podcast, try and draw a line between the two. In advance, I mean, we recommend stuff. So yes, I think this one definitely is worth an audiobook of the podcast series. But yeah, before we get stuck in, Steve, I've got a bit of a confession to make.
Another one?
Well, I'm making this one on behalf of you and me. To be honest...
Okay, thank you. Sorry in advance, then.
Yeah, well, exactly. For some reason, you and I weren't on the best of form when we interviewed Geoff.
This is very candid of you.
It's very candid. He was amazing.
You're opening our trousers, I think, here. Aren't you, really?
I am opening. I'm opening I'm showing people behind the purple velvet curtain and the magic that goes on behind. But basically, for the last week or so, I would describe trying to make sense of the questions we asked Geoff and the order we put the interview in. It's been like untangling a set of 1970s Christmas lights.
Nasty. No, sorry, dude.
Neither you nor I come across in our best light. We both geeked out on the things that you and I like to geek out on. So I was wittering on about the difference between an audiobook and a podcast, and also asking Geoff about what he thought of Simon Mayo slamming at the door on his way out of the BBC, having worked in both the commercial sector and for the BBC. You, of course, well, we learnt what your day job is, didn't we, Steve?
So one of the things, and I can't believe we're even talking about this, but it's good. It's a good thing.
It's important. It means I don't know what it actually means. Is we've got an expert in the subject.
Okay, so what I do is I do cybersecurity learning, basically, and awareness, and essentially it's helping people to not click on dodgy stuff and get themselves trapped in a fraud or nasties coming inside the computer and causing havoc. And that's what I do.
So effectively,
basically.
You are in the communication. You communicate about the dangers of the stuff of cyber stuff. And
yes, and I've seen your password, and that's why we need to have a chat after this.
but stop messing around. That's essentially what Geoff does as well. So actually, we get the interesting questions about the form, and we get the interesting questions about how do you decide what to say and what not to say when you're communicating about cybersecurity with people. So strangely enough, although it is both of us at our worst, I think it makes for a really good interview. I realise we actually haven't really set out what the Lazarus Heist in itself is about yet. Shall we let Geoff do a better job of it than we do?
Good plan.
So the story of the Lazarus Heist is basically how North Korea's accused of becoming a global cyber superpower. Because there is an intriguing question, I think most people know a little bit about North Korea, and one of the things they do know is that this country is pretty much sealed off from the outside world, and certainly for the vast majority of its citizens, it's sealed off from the internet. The things that you and I take for granted, nipping out, maybe buying a laptop at Argos, phoning up a broadband provider and getting online, that's completely unthinkable in the vast majority of cases in North Korea. So how does this country of all countries become a sort of top 4 threat to the UK? If you ask the UK's intelligence community, they'll say, our threats on cyber are in positions 1 and 2, either Russia or China, and in positions 3 or 4, either Iran or North Korea. How did North Korea end up in the top 4? And so the Lazarus Heist is the story of that, how that stuff works, the targets they've been going after, how they work, and indeed why they actually do all of this stuff. And it's a really sort of fascinating story.
Yeah, it goes. I mean, thank you for taking me to the Philippines, to Sri Lanka. The characters include grizzled undercover FBI agents, strange women who somehow are in charge of international charities. How did you pull it all together? I mean, I love the way you tell stories, but it's an incredible piece of work. How did you maintain focus and decide where to build it?
Well, in a way that it does unfold chronologically, this story, and that's the best way to tell a story. You start at the beginning and you end at the end. So we start the podcast in series 1 with the Sony hack. Then we go on to talk about Bangladesh Bank, which was targeted for $1 billion. Then WannaCry, the ransomware attack, came in 2017. And for series 2 of the podcast, which we're working on at the moment, we'll be going on from that and basically moving on forward. And for the book that I've written, it pretty much does that. It goes chronologically. What you're looking for is the sort of through line, the kind of narrative. And one of the key sort of through lines, one of the key sort of plot lines, if you like, in this, for me, and particularly that I've tried to explore in the book, is how North Korea's government hackers are accused of increasingly working with the worlds of organized cybercrime and indeed organized street level crime, because hacking's just the start of it. If I hack into your bank account, Steve or Matt, and I get the money, great. But where am I going to put it? I can't just transfer it to Geoff White because it's going to be obvious it was me who nicked it. So the hacking is just the start of it. You've then got to have a plan or a system for getting the money out and laundering it and washing it around the world so it can't be traced. And that's where you end up butting up against organized crime gangs, because that's what they do day in, day out. So there's been really interesting confluence between the nation state stuff and, as I say, the organized crime gangs. And that's where I think the running is for me as a journalist.
So are they in it for the money, or are they in it to destabilize Western society and give us all some sort of psychological damage about how our lives are run by our governments?
It's depressingly a bit of column A, bit of column B. So if you look at the different attacks that have been attributed to North Korea, the Sony hack, for example, they didn't make any money out of that, but they managed to really debilitate for quite a period of time one of the world's biggest corporations. I mean, Sony, a huge company, and for a while were forced to use fax machines and paper and pen to do business. I mean, the entire company was shut down for a period of time. That's an intimidating psychological tactic. But North Korea are not alone in being accused of carrying out those attacks. A lot of cyber attacks by nation states are aimed to demoralize and to intimidate the opponents. But if you look at something like the Bangladesh bank heist and other cryptocurrency thefts that North Korea has been carrying out, accused of carrying out, that is all about cash. And in a way, North Korea is unique in that perspective, in that most governments, certainly all the advanced governments, have a cyber attacking capability. They all have hackers working for the government, but they're going after information. They're going after strategic advantage. They're not generally trying to get hold of money. North Korea, because of the sanctions that have been put on it, because of its nuclear and missile tests, it is short of cash. And the accusation is it's used hacking to get that cash. Now, in a way, the uniqueness of North Korea makes it a really crap example to look at from a cybersecurity point of view, because North Korea is so unique, why bother looking at that as an example? I think it's really worth looking at, because that confluence of government hackers and organized cybercrime, money-motivated organized cybercrime, that crossing over of those two worlds is the furrow that I think a lot of people are going to plow. I think a lot of government's hackers are going to start working with or through or behind organized cybercrime to cover their tracks and to get access to networks. And so the path that North Korea is accused of being on, I think, is a path that a lot of other countries are going to start following, for good or ill.
You are obviously the cybersecurity expert. Sorry, Steve, coming across you again. I'm gonna get out of the way in a second, because I know you have the proper hardcore questions to ask. But I just wanted to say we accidentally mentioned your co-host Jean. Your role is the way we have to simplify these things is you're the cybersecurity expert and she is the career expert. She used to run an agency in a press agency in North Korea, so her knowledge is not in doubt. But to be honest, what I listened to, a lot of people in this story have disappeared or died. I worry for both of you, to be honest. Is your own personal security a concern?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I hate it. We take it extremely seriously. Is the straight answer to that? And Jean takes it particularly seriously because, as you say, she ran the AP bureau in North Korea for years, and so has been in and out of that country, and has experienced, in a way that I probably never will, close up and firsthand, the kind of paranoia and insecurity that comes from that, and has dealt with it very well. We do take it really seriously. The BBC takes it really seriously. We put in place as many protections as we can. Usefully, through the coverage of it, we have a good handle on what the MO of the hackers is. And usefully, a lot of that comes down to sort of phishing emails and phishing messages. So, if you want to protect yourself, and people listening to this are interested in how to protect yourself, it's that. It's watch out for dodgy attachments, watch out for dodgy links. So, touch wood, we don't think we've suffered from it. We keep an ever vigilant eye out, but the problem is never say never in the cybersecurity world.
Now, I think the world needs a lot more Geoff Whites because seriously, because there's people like him and Jamie Bartlett, all these people, they are highlighting through incredibly compelling content. The story about the Lazarus Group themselves, this bunch of hackers working on behalf of North Korea. turning over Sony, turning over the Bank of Bangladesh in such huge ways, such catastrophic ways, that it affects every single person working for Sony, for example, where they talk about how people's passes wouldn't work to get into the building for their normal work day. And this is everybody. We need more people like him, because this is something that affects all of us indirectly. You know, we're all, you know, compromised through some way, shape or form, whether it's, you know, lax passwords or, you know, we're oversharing on social media, anything like that. And that's what hackers use to get into our accounts, to get into company systems. You know, it's really simple stuff in principle, but they use incredibly complex techniques to come across as genuine, to essentially groom us into giving information out. And it's stories like the Lazarus Heist, particularly. I mean, Geoff White is one of the world's best tech journalists, in my opinion, and in a lot of other people's opinions, people who, you know, count a lot more than me. And one of his key talents is really explaining in very simple terms what happens. You know, what happens when you're hacked? What happens when criminals working on behalf of a country go in there and do some real damage to infrastructure? We had that turning over of the National Health Service, didn't we? The NHS a few years ago, when they put patients' files behind a ransomware wall. You had to pay money or we won't release them, sort of thing. And that was crippling.
Yeah, that comes up in both. That both comes up in both the Lazarus Heist podcast and in the Lazarus Heist audiobook. I agree with you about Geoff being a great tech journalist, but I think, again, what comes through both the podcast and the audiobook, and we'll get on to the difference between those two and why you need both in a minute. What goes all the way through it is he's also an amazing storyteller. So he can't help himself. The Lazarus Heist podcast series starts with the story of a Sony employee coming into work. In the audiobook, even though he's about to tell us that the storytelling is a lot straighter, there's more of a single voice, he can't help describing fields full of butterflies and parades in Pyongyang featuring people in orange spandex dancing to green disco lasers. Those are his words, not mine. So he's a really good storyteller as well. What I wanted to drill down into, because it's my area of geekery, is what is the difference between an audiobook and a podcast? We're here doing a show that's called Audiobookclub. Why do we differentiate between podcast and audiobook? And I asked him what his take on that was.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've sort of been asked about this recently and thought quite a lot about it. The key thing for me with the podcast is the voices in it, the people telling the stories. I think I'm of the opinion that the era of journalism that we had, where, you know, Mr. Journalist, it was usually Mr. Journalist, stands up and says, "Oh, this is the news. This is what has happened today," wearing their tie and their suit. I just feel like era is increasingly anachronistic. I think the future for it is finding the people who can tell the stories, who are there, and getting them to tell their stories in their own words. I think that's sort of the future. And so I think that's why podcasting is very satisfying. The job of the podcaster, for me anyway, what I feel my job is work out what the story is, work out who was in the room, find them, and get them to talk to me and tell the story. And that's it. You know, if you can do that, you're on to a winner. Because from a podcast editing point of view, you can just let that tape run. You can just say, you know, here's Mr. Such and Such or Mrs. Such and Such. They're going to talk about what happened. Off you go. And you can just run that tape and just, you know, it really helps you editing the podcast to just stay with one person and let them tell their stories. Brilliant. So that's what I feel is important with podcasting, and finding those voices and getting the best out of those voices, and being quite human about that. With the book, it's far more structural. You're far more putting the story together. You're far more guided by the bits of the narrative and the twists and turns and so on. Because you don't really need, it's nice to have good quotes in a book, but you can't, you know, in a book, you're not just going to run quote after quote after quote like you are in a podcast. So you're far more emphasizing on the sort of structural points, the kind of twists and turns. And so the stuff that I wrote in the book that the editors at Penguin said, well, that doesn't really work, take that out. One story in particular is a story of Virgil Griffith, who's an American who went to Pyongyang for a cryptocurrency conference of all things, and was then arrested by the US and imprisoned for having helped North Korea evade sanctions. It's, you know, crazy story and loads of twists and turns. I thought it was fascinating. Put it in the book. The editor said, no, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really work. It's take it out because it's getting in the way of the narrative. So, but that will feature hugely in series 2 of the podcast. We're going to do a lot on that. So there's different ways of doing things in the book and the podcast. The other thing that's nice about the book is it's all my own words. It's all my own voice. It's from an ego point of view and from a control freak point of view, it's great because you just sit there writing, and it's your words, it's your voice. And you've got more autonomy with the book, I think, as a journalist than I've ever had with any other project. I think that's why I quite enjoyed writing both of them, both the Lazarus Heist book that's coming out and crime.com that came out a couple of years ago.
And was your editor right?
Yes, they generally are. Editors bring, one of my editors at the BBC talked about was the joy of ignorance, which is they don't know the story, so they just listen to it and can, from a completely outsider's point of view, say, actually, that's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is the bit you put at the end. So yeah, they were annoyingly, they were right at Penguin, right to take it out, I think.
I think Geoff does a really good job there, Steve, of explaining what for him the difference between the audio book and the podcast are. I found the podcast, as you say, is for everybody. It's engaging. The audio book, the version of the book in audio, is more of a deep dive and a harder listen for somebody like me whose knowledge extends to what he's listened to in the podcast version. I'm enjoying it, but I do find it tough going at times.
Do you think you come into it because you've listened to the podcast first? You go in there with some preconceptions. You can be honest. No one's listening. It's fine.
No, I don't. No, I don't think that at all. I think what I get is a head start because I know who Geoff is, and I know that he's good at explaining stuff. I know I'm going to have to concentrate more when I'm listening to the audiobook. I've found that actually I've had to do it in one chapter chunks, and then I need to take a little break from it. So I'm trying to find the part of my day that it fits precisely in terms of length. It's certainly not a YouTube short video to watch on the toilet. It's more of a while you're chopping the vegetables and your hands are doing something else. It's that sort of 20-minute chunk of actually passively learning something. So I think having, as I usually do at the beginning, I go, why do you want an audiobook of a podcast? I think that actually the two media are different and that it makes sense. How about you, knowing more about the subject? Does it feel pedestrian to you at points?
No, it doesn't. No, not at all. Not at all. But that's because of what I do. I'm much more interested in getting people who don't understand this to understand it. And so where I really enjoyed the podcast from start to finish, because they made it so accessible for me. It was I remember I think I painted my house listening to that from start to finish. And it was just so easy to get into. You are right here, by the way. The difference I'm finding between the podcast and the audiobook is with the audiobook, you're being asked to work a bit harder. But I love that about audiobooks. I like actually, working a bit harder to concentrate actually a little bit more rather than being spoon-fed. Okay. Because the subject does interest me, and actually it's actually quite a good gateway in. By listening to the podcast, it's a cracking listen. I mean, it's been in the charts for ages. And you're right, it does give you that head start. And actually, if you're predisposed to actually kind of enjoying audiobooks that you have to sort of think about, I mean, we listen to fiction, don't we, on audiobook, where you have to think about the plot. I mean, some of the stuff we've been listening to, Sandman, Rivers of London, they're not. This isn't Storyteller that used to get on cassettes as a kid. You know what I mean? You have to sort of work a bit harder, which I think actually is quite a good thing.
Okay, let me put it to you another way. Would it be true to say, Steve, that you would recommend that people listen to the podcast but keep the audiobook for yourself?
I'd recommend both. I'd recommend both because I think the story itself and the way Geoff tells the story if we didn't have, I think because the Lazarus Heist podcast exists is the whole reason we're having this conversation, isn't it? If we were just reviewing the audiobook, we were probably having a slightly different conversation because there wasn't a podcast. And I think that I'd be recommending the Lazarus Heist audiobook anyway. The story's just off the clock, some of the stuff that goes on here. This is stuff that happens in movies, and actually a movie did get disrupted off the back of one of the hacks, with Sony in particular with the interview. So yeah, the story is just blows your head off.
Yeah, I agree. We're about to go. This is my second geeky question coming up. But Geoff mentioned his editor at Penguin there. I have to say this is an historic moment for thee and me, Steve. One of the videos that I do watch when I'm sitting on the loo is a car review thing called Throttle House, and it's two guys with not a dissimilar cut of jib to ours, and they recently got their first Ferrari to review, and it was a big moment for them. For us, actually, this is the first time we have been sent a preview copy of an audiobook. As we record, it is the 7th of June. The audiobook itself comes out on the 9th of June. And I'm very excited. I think that means we're getting somewhere. And I would like to give a little thank you to Jesse and Meredith at Penguin for what was a big moment for us, really, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah, it was huge. It was momentous.
I'm going to get out of the way now. Here's the bit where I did my usual tacky tabloid bit and asked about the differences between working for the BBC or for Audible or indeed for Penguin. Can I just say welcome to a podcast about audiobooks? We think about this stuff all the time. And actually, I wanted to pursue a little line of question. You mentioned your editor at Penguin. I'd like to know, was he or she right in explaining the difference between the two? And also, Simon Mayo left the BBC recently. And you've worked for the two big players. You've worked for Audible and the BBC. And on the way out, he slammed his door saying it was soul-destroying working for the BBC. You couldn't get anything done. We moved to the commercial sector to make things better. I don't think that's been your experience of working for the Beeb, has it?
No. It is fair to say that the BBC moves more slowly than other companies that I've worked for. That's fair to say. But there's a couple of things about that. Number one, they are the sort of, media of record for the UK. When I'm sourcing things, if it's a BBC article, I will generally use that as a legitimate source alongside Reuters, alongside AP. You can't get it wrong as the BBC. It's very hazardous if you do. And the second thing is they have huge resources, so you don't want to deploy those, willy-nilly, and you don't want to sort of, get confused about where you're going to deploy your resources. So yes, the BBC takes a while to sort of take aim at something, but once it takes aim at something, it gives it everything it's got. I mean, the Lazarus Heist podcast, for example, they hired billboards to promote it. We had billboards on motorways, on street corners. Once they get behind something, they really get behind something. But look, I can understand Simon's point. I'm freelance, so I get to work with smaller, more nimble operators who are just like, yeah, let's do it. Let's get that thing out now. And I work with bigger sort of behemoth type people at the BBC who say, well, we've got to have a meeting about that, and then another meeting about that meeting. I'm free, so I can dip and dive between the two. Perhaps for Simon, having worked for the behemoth for a while, he just got tired of it. I can see where he's coming from with that.
So yeah, I think he really lays it out there, doesn't he, about how working for the two different companies, very different ways of working, but they're different. One isn't necessarily better than the other, is it? I think is what he's saying there.
Well, I think as we said to him, and again, sorry, Steve, the subject matter of this podcast should be more your line of field, and you've allowed me to interrupt and ask silly questions of our guests, and we'll get down to the proper subject matter in a minute. But for me, it was really interesting to hear Geoff speak positively about his experience of working for the BBC. He also said to us a little later on, that because he was working for the BBC World Service, that meant that the podcast wasn't limited to the BBC iPlayer in the UK. So again, let me get out of the way now, and you talk to Geoff like a grown-up. Is that the way to do it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been banging on quite a lot on this podcast about how he's able to put across this story and the hazards that are involved with this story about, what happens when you click on a dodgy link, what happens when you tap a dodgy text message or something. He really sort of puts it across, the really, quite catastrophic and huge scale horror that happens with cybercrime. So I was keen for Geoff to talk to us about how he goes about making it as accessible to everybody as possible. Here he is.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for quite a long time. I put out a book in 2020 called Crime.com, which covers basically tried to cover the entirety of cybercrime, or at least the highlights of it. And prior to that was just working for Channel 4 News. So I've had quite a long experience of trying to make this stuff understandable to people. There's a couple of things that you just have to accept. Number one is you are going to have to skip over some of the detail. And one criticism I get, and it's a fair criticism, I suppose, from techies is, this was too simplistic. You didn't mention this, didn't mention that. You have to shrink down the detail to make it compelling, comprehensible to people and compelling to people. But there's a limit to that. I think the era when people didn't understand technology and were so frightened of it, I think that's gone. I think people do want to understand the tech. They do want to understand what goes on under the hood, but they want someone who can explain it to them in a way they can understand. So as long as you're there to hold their hand and say, look, this is tricky, but here's roughly how it works, that's going to help you. The other thing is I work with non-technology security specialists. So the producers I work with, the editors, Jean herself, they aren't cybersecurity experts and shouldn't be and don't need to be. And they sort of keep me on the straight and narrow in terms of if I go off on one and start trying to talk about, encryption standards and that kind of thing, public key infrastructure, they'll be like, no, that's not going to work. So so long as they can understand it and they've got a handle on it, then I think we're onto a winner. But like I say, don't underestimate the public's wish to understand this. I think one of the most amazing things is that a documentary series about cybercrime, cybersecurity became a #1 podcast hit in the UK and #7 in the US. That bodes really well, because if you're trying to say, look, people aren't interested in cybercrime, well, that's clearly BS, because they were and they are. It's just how you get them interested. That's the key thing.
How did you get into being a cybercrime reporter in the first place?
There was a couple of things driving it. One was very prosaic and one was a bit more sort of philosophical. The philosophical bit is I find it really intriguing that there's a whole underworld industry out there doing this stuff. The idea that it's, a little young hacker in his hoodie in his mum's basement just with one computer, that's just nonsense. There's an industry of people who are working together on these cybercrime projects. And there was a leak recently from one of the cybercrime gangs, a leak of their communications, which in itself is a fascinating story. But what came out through this leak was that this cybercrime gang functioned like a startup. They had an HR department who recruited people. They had an interview panel who interviewed candidates. They had a salary, like a payroll department who paid them. A sort of marketing department who were in charge of, their outreach to journalists and stuff. This is a company. This is set up like a company. And I find that fascinating. It reminds me of the drama series Stranger Things, where you have the sort of netherworld that is a sort of mirror, a creepy mirror of the world above. And I just find that fascinating. Wouldn't you want to go, if you could do so safely, to the netherworld and see how it functions? It's just this endlessly intriguing thing. Like, how do these people make these connections? How do they get together? How do they work together? How do they trust each other? I've always found that fascinating. The prosaic answer to how I got involved in this stuff was I was working at Channel 4 News and we were covering technology. And at the time we were sort of it was the Apple launch era, the iPad and the iPod and all that kind of thing. And the problem was technology was sort of treated as kind of Cassandra subject. It would sit at the end of the news program and it would be the kind of not lightweight story. The problem with being at the end of the news program is, as anybody who's worked in TV news knows, that's where you get dropped. You're in the drop zone. If something better comes in at the top of the program, you get dropped off the end. And that happened a few times. And I just got annoyed with it. And I thought, well, we'll start covering more serious stories so that we go up the news agenda so that we don't get dropped. So that's when I started discovering cybercrime and cybersecurity. And I went to these conferences and there was these people speaking about computer hacking events. And I thought, this this is where it's at. This is real victims and villains stuff. And sure enough, we went up the news agenda. And I remember the day our story led Channel 4 News. We got a cybersecurity story that led the program. And from there, you're unassailable. You can't get dropped because you're the lead story. So that was a kind of a point of honor. So that's how I got into it. And, let's face it, cybersecurity has evolved endlessly since then. We had the anonymous attacks. We had Edward Snowden. We had Stuxnet. We had all these kind of stories break out, the WannaCry attack. And it just led on from there. I don't think it's going away because the more we rely on technology as our tools, as we tend to do as human beings, the more technology is going to be vulnerable to people who want to use those to manipulate us and to rob us and so on. So depressingly, it seems to be a seam that shows no signs of being any less rich going forward.
Can I ask an finally question before my official and finally question?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So obviously we were talking about everything to do with North Korea and nation states, as it's called in sort of cyber circles, countries having a pop at other countries and destabilizing things. And of course, we can't really leave this conversation without talking about Russia and Ukraine. And do you feel that I think people were expecting a massive tsunami of attacks by Russia on Ukraine in the cyberspace. It doesn't appear on the face of it from reports to have happened to any great extent. What's your view on this? Should we be worried, in the UK, or Matt's over in Australia right now? Should we be sitting here worried about an attack from Russia? Do you think?
I think at a government level, we already are. You cannot imagine how much work's going on in places like GCHQ to look at that sort of threat and try and deter against it. And that's one of the first points I'd make in terms of the narrative of we haven't seen a cyber war yet as part of the Ukraine invasion. We have. People ignore the defensive bit of cyber war. Right now, there are armies of people fending off and defending and deterring and deflecting and preventing cyber attacks. That is cyber war. Just because it's the defensive stuff and not the attacking stuff doesn't mean it's not going on. So that's the first thing I'd sort of say. Second thing is, there has been cyber war between Russia and Ukraine for years. Since the invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, there's just been this ongoing low-level cyber war. Constant attacks, power stations were taken offline in Ukraine in 2015. The lights literally went out in hundreds of cities. These things have happened, and so it's quite difficult to sort of separate the sort of ongoing, permanent cyber war, at least long-lasting cyber war, from what's going on at the moment. I think Russia, obviously, as we now know, miscalculated, thought it would be a very short conflict and they would go in and dominate and that would take a few days, maybe a week. You don't necessarily need cyber means to do that. I think they thought, well, we'll just go in with the tanks and the guns and that'll be it. We don't need the sort of cyber attack side of it. And the other thing is, I think Russia's plan, even though they said they don't want to occupy the country, and I suspect that's true, I don't think they do want to occupy it long term. Short to medium term, they are going to have to be an occupying force. You don't want to do cyber attacks on a country and knock out its power and communications infrastructure if you're then going to have to use that infrastructure as the occupying force. So there's lots of sensible reasons why the cyber war, quotes unquote, hasn't happened, or at least the offensive cyber attacks haven't happened. The concern, I think, going forward is, obviously Russia has a very well developed, possibly the most developed in the world, of cybercrime economies and cybercrime industries. Those cybercriminal gangs are, from what we know, heavily aligned with the Russian government and its objectives, in some cases working in concert with the Russian government. Will we see a position where those cybercrime gangs, through patriotic reasons, possibly to curry favor with the Russian government, go on the offensive and increase their cyber attacks, almost as a sort of arm or an extension of the Russian government? Again, haven't seen it yet, but we do need to take this very, very seriously, because as we've seen from the WannaCry attack and other attacks like the NotPetya one, which followed on from WannaCry, it can get very destructive very quickly if somebody decides they're not going to play by the rules anymore.
Just to finish off, Geoff, Lazarus Heist 2, is there anything you can tell us that is non-spoilery and you are at liberty to say?
Look, it won't surprise anybody to learn we are heavily focusing on the cryptocurrency thefts. So if you listen to season 1, if you read the book, you will know that the North Koreans targeted, allegedly, $1 billion from Bangladesh Bank and actually ended up with a few tens of millions of dollars. So not great, but not bad, as my mum would say, better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. But they didn't get their billion. If you look at the cryptocurrency thefts that have been attributed to North Korea, it's $1.3 billion. And that's just the ones we know about. The other day, we found a theft of $1.5 million. It's not mega bucks, but that hadn't really been reported. That hadn't been added to that $1.3 billion total. So the $1.3 billion is just the ones we know about that have been declared and attributed. So you're looking at billions of dollars being attributed to North Korea in terms of its cyber theft. So we are going really heavily into that cryptocurrency side. And if you want to know how that stuff works, crypto and NFTs and all that stuff, we will, to go back to your point, we will be trying to explain that as easily and clearly and nicely as we can in the podcast. So look out for that.
Fantastic. Geoff White, best of luck with the book and the audiobook, of course, and hopefully come back again. We'll talk about the sequel to everything.
Sounds good. Sounds very good.
So there you go. That's Geoff White's Lazarus Heist audiobook. It's out now on Audible and all other good outlets. Matt, what did you think? All up, the Lazarus Heist audiobook only.
No, I can't. You can't do it without the podcast. So the Lazarus Heist podcast is brilliant. It's entertaining. It's mainstream. It's a #1 podcast for a reason. It has spawned the audiobook. The audiobook is a deeper dive. It's harder work. It asks more of you. If you enjoyed the Lazarus Heist podcast and want to know more, go for the Lazarus Heist audiobook. If you've listened to us and can't decide if you want to listen to the audiobook or not, go back and listen to episode 1 of the Lazarus Heist podcast and perhaps start from there. But you can't deny that Geoff is not only an expert on all elements of cybercrime, he's also a master communicator and storyteller. So, yeah, 2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up. Yep, same here from me. And by the way, congratulations there on your Lazarus Heist consumption roadmap you just outlined there for listeners to enjoy. Of course, we'd like to know what you think of the Lazarus Heist, the audiobook, and of course the podcast as well. You can get in touch with us on our Facebook page. You can tweet us using the hashtag Audiobookclub. We're all over social media using that hashtag Audiobookclub, and we'll read them out in next time. Also, use that self-same hashtag Audiobookclub to tell us what we should be listening to next. And with that, we shall go and go back underground, go back into our dark web of fear, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Steve.